At the exact second that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asserted to Senator John Kennedy that his perspective was merely that of an antiquated gentleman of Caucasian descent who lacked the capacity to grasp the trajectory of the coming era, she committed the monumental strategic error characteristic of excessively self-assured progressive advocates. She neglected the reality that she was disparaging an Oxford-educated Rhodes Scholar and a veteran litigator from the state of Louisiana who had dedicated an entire week to orchestrating a series of fundamental macroeconomic inquiries that a former hospitality professional turned legislator, despite her substantial governmental compensation and high-end professional wardrobe, found herself entirely unable to resolve with any degree of intellectual rigor. The news organization, CNN, had coordinated this significant broadcasted confrontation, titled The Green New Deal, a Sustainable Future or a Fiscal Fantasy, as their calculated attempt to provide left-leaning strategies with a prestigious primetime showcase, and they anticipated that the event would characterize the Republican opposition as regressive and disconnected from modern realities. They had invited Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to serve as the advocate for audacious and transformative change, positioning her as the youthful archetype of democratic socialism and the representative who had ascended to the status of a digital phenomenon with a following of 13 million on social platforms, where her widely circulated content dictated the tempo of the national political conversation. She represented the vanguard of the coming decades. They informed their audience, acting as the primary spokesperson for a generation that demanded immediate intervention regarding environmental shifts and the pursuit of social equity. They had extended an invitation to Senator John Kennedy to articulate the opposing viewpoint, expecting him to serve as the quintessential contrast, an elder statesman from the South, who would, they presumed, struggle through pre-planned talking points and consequently make Ocasio-Cortez appear exceptionally competent by way of comparison. The production team at CNN had instructed their lead journalist to grant the Congresswoman ample opportunity to articulate her perspectives, allowing her fervor to resonate with the viewers, and creating shareable highlights that would dominate internet trends for the following days. What the producers failed to recognize, and what they had neglected to investigate due to their own preconceived notions regarding Southern conservatives, was that John Kennedy possessed an academic background that included a bachelor's degree with first-class honors from Vanderbilt University, a Juris Doctor from the University of Virginia School of Law, where he contributed as an editor to the prestigious Virginia Law Review, and a Bachelor of Civil Law from Magdalene College at Oxford University, where he pursued advanced studies as a Rhodes Scholar under the tutelage of the world's most eminent legal and economic scholars. They were oblivious to the fact that beneath the unassuming Louisiana accent and the rustic analogies concerning family traditions and rural logic resided one of the most sophisticated legal and analytical intellects currently serving within the United States Congress. When Kennedy claimed to be nothing more than a simple regional attorney, he was employing the precise tactical maneuver utilized by elite litigators, deliberately diminishing expectations before completely overwhelming his adversary with superior preparation and intellectual dominance. Kennedy had committed a full week of intense labor to prepare for this confrontation with the same professional rigor he once applied to his academic defenses at Oxford University. He had meticulously analyzed every public appearance Ocasio-Cortez had made since her initial entrance into the political arena, every formal statement she had delivered on the floor of the House of Representatives, and every digital post she had published regarding the intricacies of economic legislation. He had scrutinized the Green New Deal document with a line-by-line precision, consulted with numerous financial experts to determine accurate fiscal projections, calculated the specific financial burden per American household, and documented every empirical inaccuracy and logical inconsistency within her primary proposal. He had curated a collection of visual evidence, documenting her affinity for a high-status lifestyle, including her presence at the Met Gala, her residence in an expensive urban development, and her preference for high-end designer footwear, and organized these materials to ensure they would provide the most significant rhetorical impact. He had catalogued her perceived policy shortcomings with a specific focus on the withdrawal of the Amazon HQ2 project, supported by precise statistical data and a documented chronological sequence of events. He had even secured a comically large calculator as a theatrical device, understanding that while it would elicit amusement from the audience, it would simultaneously serve to make his mathematical demonstrations more tangible and unforgettable. Most significantly, Kennedy had established his entire tactical approach on a very straightforward premise: to pose questions so elementary that an individual holding a degree in economics from Boston University should theoretically be able to resolve them with ease. He aimed to make the inquiries simple enough that the general public could instinctively understand why the responses were vital, and when she inevitably struggled or provided erroneous data, he would allow that failure to serve as its own critique. He saw no necessity for ad hominem attacks or convoluted philosophical arguments. He required only basic questions, irrefutable empirical data, and the stark, devastating divergence between her academic credentials and her actual grasp of the subject matter. What would transpire during the following 90 minutes would transform a digital celebrity into a hesitant and confused figure who was unable to account for the origin of $93 trillion, unable to validate her own academic specialization, and unable to harmonize her personal affluence with her socialist public messaging. If you have ever desired to witness the outcome when a Rhodes Scholar employs elementary-level arithmetic to dismantle someone who believes that economic policy is defined by whatever receives approval on social media, this is that definitive occasion. And the moment Kennedy reveals the photographs of her high-end residence at the 34th minute, she falls into a state of absolute, stunned silence. The CNN broadcast facility in Atlanta was meticulously configured to produce the highest level of theatrical intensity, featuring high seats positioned toward one another on an elevated stage, with a journalist's podium situated between the participants. Expansive digital displays were strategically placed to showcase evidentiary materials, and an audience of 400 individuals was carefully curated to represent a wide spectrum of the American political landscape. The attendees were divided almost equally, with youthful advocates of the progressive movement wearing apparel, supporting the Green New Deal, and pins representing democratic socialism on one side, while more traditional conservatives in their preferred political attire occupied the other, with a central contingent of truly impartial moderates situated in between. The atmosphere within the studio was remarkably tense, as this was not merely a debate over legislative policy, but a profound collision between generations, a conflict between the ideals of democratic socialism and the long-standing traditions of American capitalism, between the politics of social media visibility and the realities of legislative tenure, and between the brevity of internet sound bites and the depth of substantive policy development. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made her entrance first to an overwhelming wave of support from her followers, appearing in a perfectly tailored, light-colored professional suit that likely exceeded the monthly housing costs of the average American citizen. Senator John Kennedy emerged shortly thereafter to a similarly enthusiastic reception from his supporters and a respectful acknowledgement from the other attendees. At 72 years of age, with his silver hair and reading glasses secured by a chain over a modest suit that appeared to be from a standard retail store, he embodied the exact image that CNN had anticipated: the archetype of an out-of-touch, elder conservative. The host, Jake Tapper, initiated the program by discussing the critical importance of evaluating the economic and ecological trajectory of the United States. Ocasio-Cortez appeared highly motivated, prepared to articulate her established narrative, while Kennedy seemed tranquil and nearly entertained, behaving like someone who possessed knowledge of a profound irony that the rest of the world had yet to discover. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," Jake began, "let us initiate the discussion with your perspective on why the Green New Deal is the essential path forward for the American nation." She immediately began her well-practiced presentation, asserting that the Green New Deal is a response to the recognition of an existential threat. "Environmental changes are not a vague future concern," she claimed. "They are occurring presently, and we require bold, radical intervention, rather than minor adjustments, suggesting a total restructuring of our financial system that generates millions of employment opportunities while preserving the ecological health of the world." She turned her attention to Kennedy, her tone becoming increasingly adversarial, as she stated that the senator represents the old guard and the regressive mindset that precipitated this crisis. Individuals who prioritize the earnings of corporations over the survival of humanity, and who cannot conceive of a different future because they are anchored in the past. Kennedy smiled broadly and adjusted his eyewear, and when he spoke, his regional accent was remarkably pronounced. "Well, Representative, that is quite a vivid description, and I genuinely respect your conviction. I truly do." He paused, his smile becoming more prominent. "But I am merely a simple regional lawyer from Louisiana, and I have a few inquiries that might assist the audience in grasping your proposal a bit more clearly, provided that is acceptable to you." Jake directed the conversation back to the senator, inquiring about his specific reservations regarding the Green New Deal. "Oh, I am not certain if reservations is the correct term," Kennedy remarked, as he retrieved a comically oversized calculator from beneath his chair and placed it on his lap, causing the audience to erupt in laughter. "I am simply inquisitive about some of the arithmetic involved, for I have a fondness for numbers. They are inherently truthful and do not care about your political affiliations or your digital following, for they simply represent objective reality." "Now, Congresswoman," Kennedy proceeded in his characteristic folksy tone, "you attended Boston University and earned a degree in the field of economics, which is a significant achievement and something I am sure your family takes great pride in. That institution currently requires an investment of approximately $60,000 annually, does it not? Which would mean roughly $250,000 was invested in your higher education. I applied myself diligently to earn that degree," Ocasio-Cortez stated. "I am certain that you did, without any doubt," Kennedy replied with a warm smile. "So, given that extensive training in economic principles, perhaps you can assist me in understanding a statement I encountered in a video where you were discussing the labor market, where you claimed that unemployment remains low because every citizen is working 2 separate jobs. Do you recall making that assertion?" Her expression became noticeably more tense as she replied that her words were being removed from their intended context. "I am prepared to present the entire segment to ensure the full context is preserved, if that is agreeable," Kennedy countered. He signaled to the production team, and the video appeared on the large screens, showing the Congresswoman in an interview stating with total sincerity that unemployment is low because everyone has high jobs, with people working 60 to 80 hours a week while still struggling to meet their basic needs. The video concluded, and Kennedy turned to the crowd with a look of theatrical bewilderment. "Now, I am just a rural resident, but that logic does not seem to align with reality. If I am employed in 2 positions, am I recorded twice when the government determines the unemployment rate?" He looked toward various parts of the audience, asking the attendees to clarify if someone with high jobs is counted as high separate workers or a single worker holding high positions. The audience responded in unison that it was one person, and Kennedy nodded in agreement. "That was my understanding, as unemployment measures the percentage of individuals who lack employment. If you hold high jobs, you are counted once as an employed individual, not twice, for that is a fundamental rule of statistics. He turned back to the Congresswoman, maintaining a pleasant smile, and noted that when you asserted that the unemployment rate is low because everyone holds two jobs, you were entirely incorrect, were you not? Ocasio-Cortez shifted her position uncomfortably and argued that the broader message she was conveying was what truly mattered. The broader message loses its validity if the foundational arithmetic is incorrect, Representative. You possess an academic degree from a prestigious institution, yet you seem to misunderstand how basic labor statistics are gathered, and that causes me concern when you are proposing a total overhaul of the American economic system. The conservative attendees expressed their approval, while the progressive section seemed increasingly uneasy. But Kennedy was far from finished. Let us discuss the Amazon situation. Do you have a recollection of the Amazon project? Her jaw was firmly set as she anticipated the direction of this line of questioning. Amazon intended to establish their secondary headquarters in New York, and your specific district would have seen the creation of 25,000 employment opportunities for your neighbors' high-quality, well-paying positions in the technology sector that many individuals aspire to hold. He retrieved printed documents and noted that the agreement included $3 billion in tax incentives spread over a decade, but Amazon was projected to produce $27 billion in tax revenue for the city of New York during that same time frame. That is $27 billion minus the $3 billion in incentives, which my large calculator indicates would result in a net gain of $24 billion for New York, he said, tapping the giant device for a humorous effect. However, you led the opposition against it, and as a result, Amazon withdrew, taking those 25,000 jobs and that $27 billion in potential revenue with them, leaving New York with nothing at all. Kennedy looked at the audience and remarked that the Congresswoman had claimed those $3 billion in tax breaks could have been utilized for other purposes. Representative, tax incentives are not funds that the government possesses to spend. They are funds that the government agrees not to collect from a specific entity. Without the presence of Amazon, New York has no revenue to collect from them, for you cannot allocate funds that you never possessed. He shook his head in a display of exaggerated shock, noting that you had transformed $27 billion in potential income into zero and characterized it as a victory. Now, I am just a simple individual, but in my experience, turning $27 billion into nothing is not an achievement. It is a massive failure. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to defend her position by claiming those positions would have been exploitative in nature. Exploitative, Kennedy questioned with raised eyebrows, noting that the average salary for those positions was $150,000 annually. I suspect most citizens would welcome being exploited for such a compensation package. The audience laughed, including some within the progressive section. Kennedy leaned back, still wearing his paternal smile, and observed that it was troubling that she held an economics degree but misunderstood unemployment data and the difference between tax incentives and government expenditures. You caused your constituents to lose 25,000 jobs because you lacked a grasp of basic economic principles, he said, looking at her directly. And now you intend to restructure the entire national economy with a $93 trillion proposal, should the public be concerned? I believe that perhaps we should, because you hold an economics degree, but believe that individuals with two jobs are counted twice in the data. Jake Tapper attempted to redirect the conversation toward the specific details of the Green New Deal proposal. Yes, let us proceed to that, Kennedy agreed with enthusiasm, lifting his oversized calculator. Nothing demonstrates thorough preparation quite like using visual aids that cause an adversary to become anxious. Ocasio-Cortez began her explanation, asserting that the Green New Deal would generate millions of jobs by restructuring the energy infrastructure, updating building standards, and investing in public transit systems. "What is the total projected cost?" Kennedy asked gently. She responded that the investment would eventually pay for itself through various means, but Kennedy persisted in asking for the total estimated expense. "The projections vary depending on several factors," she began, but Kennedy stated flatly that $93 trillion was the most reliable estimate from various economic investigations. "Is that figure within the expected range?" he asked. Ocasio-Cortez reacted with irritation, asserting that it was a talking point pushed by political opponents. "Representative, that figure originates from economic studies conducted by academic institutions, not from partisan blogs. Professional economists have determined the cost of your proposal and arrived at the $93 trillion figure." He began pressing buttons on his giant calculator with a display of intense focus. "Let me determine the math here. $93 trillion divided by the approximately 128 million households in this country." He tapped more buttons and looked at the screen, stating that the result is a cost of approximately $726,000 per household. He looked at the crowd and asked if they could afford a bill of $726,000 because that would be their personal portion of the plan. The audience responded with a resounding no from all sections. "I cannot afford that either," Kennedy noted cheerfully. "And I am a member of the United States Senate. If it is beyond my means, how can an average family be expected to pay for it?" He turned back to the Congresswoman and asked the fundamental question: how do we secure the funding for $93 trillion? Ocasio-Cortez claimed it would be managed in the same way the nation funded World War II and the original New Deal. Kennedy stopped her immediately, noting that World War II cost roughly $4 trillion in contemporary currency, while her proposal is 23 times more expensive than the entire effort to defeat the Axis powers. He allowed the magnitude of that comparison to resonate before stating that the analogy was invalid and asking again how the $93 trillion would be secured. "Through progressive taxation and the elimination of corporate loopholes," she replied. "I am asking for specific figures," Kennedy pressed, noting that even if every billionaire in the country were taxed at a rate of 100%, it would only yield about $5 trillion, leaving a deficit of $88 trillion. She struggled to respond, mentioning the need for restructuring. "If we confiscated every cent from every citizen earning over $100,000 annually, we still could not cover the cost, and we would be forced to tax the middle class into a state of poverty. Is that the intention?" he asked. She denied that was the plan, but Kennedy asked what the actual plan was then, pointing out that she authored the proposal and claimed it was vital for survival, yet could not explain the funding. There was a profound silence, as Ocasio-Cortez was unable to provide an answer. Kennedy then produced printed documents, noting that her office had published an informational document regarding the Green New Deal that was subsequently removed from the Internet. "Do you recall the reason for that?" he asked, and she replied that it was merely a preliminary draft. "It stated that you intended to provide economic security for individuals who are either unable or unwilling to work," he noted, showing the highlighted sections of the deleted document on the screens. "You intended to provide financial support to those who simply chose not to work. How does that benefit the national economy?" The audience was now laughing openly, and even some of her supporters appeared surprised. He also pointed out that the document mentioned a concern regarding bovine emissions, quoting the text, which stated a goal of net zero emissions because of the uncertainty regarding the total elimination of methane from livestock. The laughter in the room was overwhelming. "You also intended to expand high-speed rail to such an extent that air travel would become obsolete," he noted, asking the audience how they would reach Hawaii, perhaps by swimming or taking a train across the ocean. He turned back to the Congresswoman, his tone becoming more earnest despite his folksy delivery. "You removed this document from the Internet because people began asking fundamental questions that you could not resolve, such as the total cost, the source of the funding, the fate of the aviation industry, and the impact on the millions of jobs that depend on air travel. He tapped his calculator again, summarizing the points. A cost of over $700,000 per household, the end of air travel, financial security for those unwilling to work, and government control over energy, housing, and the majority of the economy. I am just a simple regional lawyer, but I recognize a catastrophic arrangement when I see one. And this is the most poorly constructed deal in history. It carries a cost that cannot be funded, eliminates industries that provide millions of jobs, and transfers total authority to the government. This is not a beneficial arrangement, he concluded, but a devastating deal for every American family. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to regain her composure by stating the need to tax the wealthy. Speaking of the wealthy, Kennedy interrupted with a playful smile, "Let us discuss your own situation." He retrieved a folder of photographs, and she appeared to have walked directly into his prepared trap. He displayed an image of her at the Met Gala in her widely discussed Tax the Rich apparel, posing on the red carpet with various celebrities. "This is you at the Met Gala, in a very striking gown with a very clear message," he noted, before pausing to mention that the cost of a single ticket to the event is $35,000. The audience reacted with a collective gasp. Now, I am just a rural resident. But $35,000 seems like an extraordinary amount for a single social gathering, as it represents more than half of what a typical American family earns in an entire year. He asked the audience if any of them had ever attended a party that cost $35,000, and there were no hands raised. "I have not either," he admitted. "The most significant investment I ever made for a party was for my daughter's wedding, and it was nowhere near that amount." He turned back to her and asked if she recognized the inherent contradiction in wearing that message to an event that costs more than what most citizens earn. She tried to explain that she was invited as a legislative representative, but Kennedy countered that she was invited due to her celebrity status and went to an elite gathering while average people struggle with housing costs. He produced more images showing the luxury urban development where she resides in Washington, D.C., highlighting its high-end amenities like a rooftop pool and concierge service. He noted the monthly rent was $2,700, or over $32,000 annually, which is more than many families earn in total income. More images appeared, showing her in designer footwear that costs nearly $600 a pair. Kennedy retrieved his own wallet and noted that he wears boots from a standard retail store that cost $39 and serve their purpose perfectly. "What do $600 shoes provide that my boots do not?" he asked. The audience responded with laughter and applause. He also pointed out that she owns a high-end electric vehicle worth $50,000, all while telling working families they must make sacrifices and attacking the traditional energy sector. He systematically listed the expenses: a $35,000 gala ticket, a $2,700 monthly rent, $600 shoes, a $50,000 car, and a salary of $174,000 annually. "And yet you have claimed that your salary is insufficient for your needs," he noted. "While the median household income in the nation is $70,000. The audience responded with loud disapproval. Kennedy held up his hands and stated that he was not arguing against a good salary for members of Congress, but that one cannot advocate for equality while living in luxury. You cannot wear messages about taxing the wealthy at elite parties or attack the foundations of capitalism while enjoying its most exclusive benefits. He looked at her and claimed to be honest about his own comfortable but modest life, while asserting that she lived like the elite 1%, while claiming to represent the struggling majority. "You are a champagne socialist, representative, and in my part of the country, we have a specific term for that, a hypocrite." Jake Tapper tried to move to the next topic regarding representation. "Yes, let us discuss who you truly represent," Kennedy agreed. Ocasio-Cortez claimed to be a voice for the Bronx and working families, but Kennedy interrupted to look at her actual origins. He displayed a map showing that while the Bronx is geographically close to Westchester, they are worlds apart in every other metric. He pointed out the Bronx's modest household income and high poverty rate, and then moved to Yorktown Heights in Westchester County, where she actually spent her formative years. Images of beautiful suburban homes and manicured lawns appeared on the screens, with Kennedy noting the high median income and home values in the area. You claim to be from the Bronx, but you grew up in one of the most affluent counties in the country. Why is that? She explained that her family moved when she was very young, but Kennedy noted that she was raised in a comfortable suburban environment, with an architect father and a mother in real estate. "This is where you were raised," he said, showing images of a nice suburban residence. He also brought up her education at Boston University, which cost $250,000, an investment most working-class families could never consider. He noted that she worked as a bartender for a period after college, as many people do, but criticized the narrative that she was barely surviving, given her expensive degree and privileged background. He displayed a comparison on the screen between the story she tells the girl from the Bronx struggling to survive and the reality of her comfortable Westchester upbringing and expensive education. "You have manufactured a narrative that serves you politically because it is effective branding," he stated. "But it is not truthful, and being dishonest about your origins is an insult to those who actually endure true hardship. There are people here who truly struggled to meet their basic needs and could never dream of such an education. Yet you pretend to be one of them." He concluded with the observation that she is not representing the working class, but merely pretending to be them, which he characterized as worse than simply being wealthy. Kennedy then moved to the topic of her grandmother in Puerto Rico, noting that using family members for political purposes should have limits, even for socialists. He reminded the audience that after a major hurricane, she had posted about the damage to her grandmother's residence, using the situation to criticize the government's response. He showed her social media posts on the screen and then brought up a new set of documents. He noted that a conservative commentator had organized a fundraising effort to assist her grandmother, which successfully raised over $14,000 from citizens who wanted to help. However, her office rejected the funds, refusing to allow her grandmother to receive the assistance. The audience responded with shock and disapproval. Kennedy asked why she would reject funds that could have helped her family member, and she claimed it was a political maneuver. "Representative, it was over $14,000 in genuine aid for your grandmother, whom you claimed was suffering," he countered. He asked if the residence had ever been repaired, and she admitted she was not certain of the current status. "You do not know the status of your own grandmother's home," he asked, pointing out that in his culture, family always comes before politics. He noted that the funds came from people she has likely characterized as political enemies, yet they were the ones who offered real help, which she declined. "You utilized her suffering to achieve social media visibility and attack your opponents, but when real assistance was offered, you rejected it because your political brand was more important than her welfare." He expressed profound disgust at the idea that social media trends and political image were prioritized over family needs. Jake Tapper, visibly affected by the intensity of the debate, tried to bring the session to a close. "Let us evaluate your actual work in Congress," Kennedy said, retrieving a very thin folder and showing it to the crowd. He opened it to reveal a single empty page. "In 3 years of service, how many major legislative achievements have you accomplished that became law?" he asked, and the answer was 0. She tried to claim she had introduced important legislation, but Kennedy noted the vast difference between introducing a bill and actually passing it. He listed her proposals, noting that they had all failed or been rejected by her own party's leadership. "What have you truly achieved besides a large following on Twitter?" he asked, He noted that she had effectively chased away 25,000 jobs from her own district and had not passed a single significant piece of legislation. Social media followers do not repair infrastructure or create employment opportunities, he noted. Being a legislator is about governance and delivering tangible results. He compared her thin folder with his own thick record of past legislation and funded projects in Louisiana, stating that this is what actual governing looks like. You are an influencer who happened to be elected, but your constituents deserve more than social media presence. They deserve substance and actual results. In the final minutes, Kennedy proposed a brief quiz for the Congresswoman regarding the economic principles she had studied for 4 years. He asked how unemployment is determined, and she correctly identified it as the percentage of the workforce without jobs. So, if someone has 2 jobs, they are counted how many times? He asked. She admitted it was only once, and Kennedy noted that her previous claim was fundamentally and mathematically incorrect. He then asked if tax incentives are government expenditures or revenue not collected, and she conceded they were the latter, proving her previous claims about the Amazon funding were also incorrect. Finally, he asked again how the $93 trillion plan would be funded, and when she could not provide a specific answer, he summarized her entire profile for the audience. An economics degree she does not understand, a manufactured background, an unfunded $93 trillion proposal, a luxury lifestyle while preaching socialism, and a lack of legislative achievements. Economics is about reality and math, not about intentions or feelings, he stated. Socialism has failed every time it has been attempted, because it prioritizes government control over productivity. Real leadership is about understanding policy and delivering results, not about going viral. You are an influencer, representative, but you are not qualified to manage the national economy. And that is a dangerous reality. The conservative section responded with a standing ovation as Ocasio-Cortez sat motionless, her confidence evidently shaken. Kennedy acknowledged the crowd, thanked the host, and walked off the stage as the debate concluded. And the Congresswoman's credibility as a policy expert was effectively diminished in the eyes of many. The footage of the event achieved unprecedented viral status, reaching over 200 million viewers within a week, and sparking a national conversation about the difference between digital popularity and substantive expertise. Ocasio-Cortez's influence began to decline, as the public recognized she could not defend her own proposals, while Kennedy's national profile rose significantly. The event eventually led to a primary challenge against her and her eventual decision to leave Congress, serving as a lasting lesson that in the arena of public policy, substance and preparation will always prevail over style and social media following. Reality eventually overcomes fantasy, and a mastery of the facts will always defeat a narrative that cannot withstand basic scrutiny. If you value knowledge and results over social media trends, share this account, for it demonstrates that you cannot manage a nation on digital approval and unfunded proposals. Substance prevails over appearance in every meaningful way. The immediate aftermath within the CNN studio in Atlanta was characterized by a palpable and disorienting silence, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room the moment the cameras ceased broadcasting. Jake Tapper, a veteran journalist accustomed to managing contentious political disagreements, sat momentarily motionless at his desk, shuffling his papers with the vacant expression of a moderator who realized he had just presided over not merely a debate, but a total dismantling of a political celebrity's intellectual infrastructure. The audience, which had been carefully curated to represent a balanced spectrum of the American electorate, appeared collectively stunned. The progressive contingent, who had arrived with the expectation of witnessing a coronation of their champion, sat in a state of muted disbelief, their Green New Deal banners resting limply in their laps, while the conservative section, having anticipated a biased ambush against the senator, remained standing in a prolonged ovation that felt less like political partisanship and more like a cathartic release of years of frustration at being lectured by individuals who could not balance a checkbook. In the green room backstage, the atmosphere among Ocasio-Cortez's staff was reportedly funereal, a sharp contrast to the buoyant confidence that had permeated the pre-show preparations. Her communications director, typically a whirlwind of digital activity, stared at a smartphone screen where the initial clips were already beginning to circulate with viral velocity, recognizing with a sinking dread that no amount of narrative spinning or rapid response tweeting could undo the 90 minutes of high-definition exposure that had just occurred. Kennedy, by contrast, thanked the production crew with the same unpretentious courtesy he had displayed on stage, collected his oversized calculator and his thin folder of legislative accomplishments, and departed the venue with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who had successfully completed a complex renovation. If the debate itself was a surgical dismantling, the subsequent reaction across the digital landscape was nothing short of an avalanche, a cascading event that redefined the metrics of political virality. Within the first hour, the clip of Kennedy asking the simple unemployment question had been viewed 28 million times, leaping across platform boundaries from Twitter to TikTok to Facebook, with a speed that defied algorithmic suppression. The video did not merely trend. It dominated the global conversation, displacing breaking news and celebrity gossip to become the singular focal point of the internet. The reason for this unprecedented spread was not simply partisan confirmation bias, but rather the universal intelligibility of the encounter. One did not need a degree in political science to understand the visceral embarrassment of someone being unable to explain their own degree, nor did one need to be a conservative to appreciate the comedic timing of Kennedy's calculator prop. The juxtaposition was visually and intellectually perfect. The meticulously styled high-fashion influencer stammering through basic definitions versus the rumpled, white-haired Southern lawyer calmly delivering a masterclass in Socratic questioning. It became the most shared political clip in the history of social media, not because it was hateful or angry emotions that often drive engagement, but because it was undeniably, painfully revealing. It was the emperor's new clothes moment for the Instagram age, a collective realization that the digital avatar of expertise that Ocasio-Cortez had cultivated for years had no correlation with her actual capabilities in the physical world. The reaction from the established media ecosystem was immediate and polarized, yet united by a common thread of shock. On the conservative side of the spectrum, the mood was one of vindication bordering on euphoria. Fox News, recognizing that they had been handed the most effective piece of political theater in a decade, suspended their regular programming lineup to dissect the debate frame by frame. Sean Hannity devoted his entire opening monologue to what he termed the Kennedy Clinic, contrasting the senator's preparation with the Congresswoman's vacuous slogans, framing it as the definitive proof that the modern progressive movement was an intellectual hollow shell polished to a high sheen by a compliant media. Tucker Carlson delivered a segment that would become nearly as viral as the debate itself, a 15-minute deconstruction of the expert class, arguing that Ocasio-Cortez was merely a symptom of a broader societal rot, where credentials were valued over competence and emotional performance was prioritized over factual accuracy. He played the clip of her failing to explain funding mechanisms on a loop, using it to argue that the entire edifice of modern socialist economics was built on the presumption that no one would ever bother to check the math. Laura Ingraham invited actual economics professors onto her program, not to debate policy, but to use Kennedy's questions as a pedagogical tool, effectively turning a primetime cable news show into an introductory macroeconomic seminar that highlighted exactly where and how the Congresswoman had failed. Conversely, the reaction within the legacy media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times, was characterized by a chaotic mixture of denial, deflection, and reluctant acceptance. In the immediate post-debate analysis on CNN, the panelists struggled to reconcile the reality they had just broadcast with the narrative they had spent years constructing. Initial attempts to frame Kennedy's questioning as condescending or mansplaining died on the vine, primarily because his tone had been unfailingly polite, soft-spoken, and respectful throughout the entire encounter. He had not raised his voice, he had not interrupted her answers, and he had even offered to help her with the calculations. To attack his demeanor would have only highlighted the weakness of her responses, a trap that even the most partisan pundits recognized they could not escape. MSNBC attempted to ignore the substance of the economic questions entirely, focusing instead on the theatrics of the calculator prop, but their viewers were already watching the raw footage on their phones and drawing their own conclusions. The dissonance between the pundits' spin and the objective reality of the video clips created a credibility gap that the networks could not bridge. The New York Times, in a surprisingly candid piece of analysis published 48 hours later, finally broke the dam with an article titled, "When Style Meets Substance," acknowledging that the debate had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the progressive movement's strategy of elevating charismatic figures who lacked legislative or policy depth. The article noted that while Ocasio-Cortez remained a potent symbol, her inability to defend her signature legislative proposal against basic scrutiny raised legitimate questions about her fitness for higher leadership, a concession that would have been unthinkable in the pages of the Times just a week prior. Beyond the immediate political news cycle, the debate triggered a profound cultural shift that permeated unexpected sectors of American life. The phrase bartender economics entered the national lexicon almost overnight, becoming a shorthand for any policy proposal that sounded appealing in a 30-second soundbite but crumbled under the weight of basic arithmetic. It became a cultural meme, transcending politics, to become a general descriptor for incompetence, masked by confidence. Merchandise featuring Kennedy's calculator and the slogan, "Do the math," appeared on college campuses, often worn ironically by business students or earnestly by young conservatives who finally felt they had a champion who could dismantle socialist rhetoric without resorting to anger. The comedic potential of the encounter was exploited by late-night hosts and internet satirists alike, who found in the simple country lawyer persona a rich vein of humor that cut through the usual partisan divides. Skits appeared depicting everyday situations: a mechanic trying to explain a bill, a student trying to explain a late assignment where the person would channel Kennedy's folksy delivery to expose a lie, cementing the senator's performance as a touchstone of pop culture. The Kennedy stare, that look of patient, grandfatherly disappointment he wore while waiting for her to answer a basic question, became one of the most widely used reaction images on the internet, a universal symbol for witnessing someone dig their own grave through ignorance. Perhaps the most significant and lasting impact, however, occurred within the halls of academia and economic institutions. For years, there had been a growing tension within university economics departments between traditional scholars and a vocal minority of students and junior faculty who advocated for modern monetary theory and other heterodox economic frameworks that underpinned proposals like the Green New Deal. Many senior professors had remained silent, fearful of the professional backlash that often accompanied criticism of progressive darlings. Kennedy's performance shattered that silence by making the critique of these policies not only acceptable, but intellectually necessary. In the weeks following the debate, stories began to emerge from universities across the country of professors incorporating the debate footage into their curriculum. It was not used as political propaganda, but as a rigorous case study in the consequences of conceptual error. At the University of Chicago, a clip of Ocasio-Cortez confusing tax incentives with direct government spending was used in Public Finance 101 to illustrate the difference between fiscal expenditures and tax expenditures. At the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, The debate was dissected in seminars on political communication as a definitive example of the dangers of unprepared advocacy, teaching future policymakers that passion is not a substitute for preparation. Business schools utilized the encounter in negotiation and strategy courses to demonstrate the effectiveness of the Columbo method, the art of playing the underdog, lowering an opponent's guard with humility and then striking with overwhelming factual command. Kennedy's strategy was reverse-engineered by communication experts, who noted how he systematically removed Ocasio-Cortez's ability to use her standard defenses. He didn't attack her character, so she couldn't claim victimhood. He didn't attack her race or gender, so she couldn't claim bigotry. He simply asked math questions, forcing her to fight on a battlefield of objective facts where she had no ammunition. This academic validation of Kennedy's victory served to further isolate Ocasio-Cortez. It was one thing to be mocked by Sean Hannity, which she could wear as a badge of honor, but it was entirely another to be used as a what not to do example in the very economics textbooks she claimed to have mastered. The intellectual hegemony that had protected her from serious scrutiny had been breached, and through that breach poured a torrent of substantive critique that had been dammed up for years. The impact on Ocasio-Cortez's digital empire, the very source of her power, was catastrophic and quantifiable. Prior to the debate, her social media feed was a hermetically sealed ecosystem of adoration, where every tweet was met with hundreds of thousands of likes and reinforcing comments. In the post-debate reality, that ecosystem collapsed. Her tweets regarding economic inequality or corporate greed, which had once generated waves of support, were now immediately ratioed a phenomenon where the critical replies vastly outnumber the likes and retweets. The replies were no longer just hateful trolling. They were filled with the specific ammunition Kennedy had provided. Users would post screenshots of the calculator, ask her to define unemployment, or simply comment $726,000 per household on every post she made. The veil of expertise had been pierced, and the suspension of disbelief that allows an influencer to function had evaporated. Her follower count, which had been on a steady upward trajectory for years, began to bleed, losing nearly 500,000 followers in the first month as the bandwagon effect reversed itself. Casual observers, those who had followed her because she seemed cool or relevant, disengaged as she became associated with incompetence. The algorithm, detecting this shift in engagement sentiment from positive to negative, began to deprecate her content, further reducing her reach, and effectively deplatforming her from the cultural conversation she had once dominated. This digital collapse had tangible, real-world consequences. The fundraising machine that had made her a power player in the Democratic Party began to sputter. Small-dollar donations, driven by the excitement of her viral moments, dried up as her viral moments turned into humiliations. Major donors in the Democratic establishment, who had tolerated her radicalism because of her popularity, saw the writing on the wall. They recognized that she had become a liability, a walking attack ad that Republicans could use to paint the entire party as economically illiterate. Invitations to speak at major conferences, to headline fundraisers for other candidates, or to appear on Sunday morning talk shows began to disappear. She was becoming radioactive, a political figure who brought all the baggage of radical socialism with none of the benefits of intellectual credibility. The Squad, the progressive coalition she led, began to fracture as other members sought to distance themselves from the fallout, wary of being asked the same simple economic questions that had destroyed their leader. The collective realization in Washington was brutal and swift. The Queen was dead, slain not by a dragon, but by a calculator. In the frigid political winter that descended upon Washington in the months following the Atlanta debate, the legislative isolation of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became absolute and suffocating, a phenomenon of exclusion that was as brutal as it was silent. The halls of Congress are an ecosystem predicated on leverage and credibility. When those two currencies evaporate, a member ceases to function as a legislator and becomes merely a tenant of an office building. For the Congresswoman, the transition from being the celebrated vanguard of the Democratic Party to a legislative pariah was precipitous. In the immediate wake of the Kennedy confrontation, she attempted to pivot back to her standard operating procedure, introducing a series of ambitious procedural amendments aimed at reviving the spirit of the Green New Deal. In a previous era, these maneuvers would have garnered co-sponsorships from dozens of progressive allies and forced leadership to engage in delicate negotiations to maintain party unity. Now, however, her proposals were met with a terrifying indifference. Senior Democrats, sensing the shift in the political winds, avoided her in the corridors and instructed their staffs to diplomatically decline any joint initiatives. The radioactive nature of her brand meant that association with her was no longer a badge of progressive purity, but a liability that invited ridicule. When she rose to speak on the floor of the House, the chamber, which had once filled with members eager to hear a viral soundbite, now emptied with conspicuous speed, leaving her to address rows of vacant leather seats and the indifferent lens of the C-SPAN camera. She had been stripped of the most vital asset a politician possesses: the perception of power. The vacuum created by her collapse was rapidly filled by a resurgence of pragmatic governance, but the true death knell for her political career arrived in the form of a primary challenge that was as mathematically precise as Senator Kennedy's calculator. For years, moderate Democrats in her district had chafed under her representation, feeling that their tangible needs, sanitation, policing, infrastructure, were being neglected in favor of national celebrity and ideological posturing. They had lacked a catalyst to mobilize a credible opposition, but the debate provided the perfect weaponization of their grievances. The challenger who emerged was David Torres, a former military logistics officer and small business owner whose profile was the antithesis of the influencer politician. Torres did not have millions of Twitter followers, nor did he possess a designer wardrobe. What he possessed was a terrifyingly effective campaign strategy built entirely around the footage from the CNN debate. His campaign commercials were masterpieces of minimalist brutality. One 30-second spot consisted entirely of the clip where Ocasio-Cortez failed to explain how to fund the $93 trillion cost, followed by a black screen with white text that simply read, "If she can't do the math, she can't do the job." Another ad juxtaposed her "Tax the Rich" dress at the Met Gala, with footage of deteriorating subway stations in the Bronx, overlaid with Kennedy's voice asking about her luxury apartment rent. These were not ideological attacks that could be deflected with accusations of racism or sexism. They were competence attacks, and against them, she had no defense. The campaign trail became a gauntlet of humiliation. Attempting to recapture the grassroots energy that had propelled her to office, Ocasio-Cortez organized a series of town hall meetings across her district, expecting the adoration of her base to reinvigorate her spirit. Instead, she encountered a constituency that had been thoroughly educated by the viral dissemination of the Kennedy debate. At a community center in Queens, a video surfaced that would serve as the final bookend to her career. A local union worker, a man who had supported her in 2018, stood up during the Q&A session. He did not ask about social justice or international relations. He held up a printed copy of her deleted, frequently asked questions document regarding the Green New Deal. With a camera rolling, he asked a question that echoed Kennedy's logic. "Congresswoman, you proposed paying people who are unwilling to work. I wake up at 4 a.m. every day to drive a truck. Why should my taxes pay for my neighbor to stay home because he simply doesn't want to work?" When she attempted to pivot to a talking point about human dignity and structural inequality, the room erupted not in applause, but in jeers. The Kennedy effect had permeated the electorate. Voters were no longer accepting rhetorical flour in place of bread. They demanded specific numbers, funded plans, and logical consistency. The footage of her being shouted down by her own working-class constituents circulated with the same ferocity as the debate itself, cementing the narrative that she had lost not just the argument, but the people. Internal polling conducted by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, painted a picture of electoral annihilation. The data showed that her favorability rating had inverted completely. Where she was once seen as passionate and fresh, she was now viewed by 68% of likely primary voters as incompetent and out of touch. The metric that alarmed party strategists the most was the credibility index, a measure of how much voters trusted a candidate on economic issues. Her score had dropped to single digits, a statistical anomaly for an incumbent. The party leadership, pragmatic to the core and ruthless in their pursuit of retaining the majority, made the calculated decision to cut her loose. There would be no rescue funds, no high-profile endorsements from party elders, and no mobilized ground game to save her. Nancy Pelosi, in a background conversation with reporters that was leaked with intentional precision, remarked that the party exists to govern, not to trend, a signaling flare that the experiment with celebrity socialism was officially over. Faced with a 20-point deficit in the polls, a fundraising apparatus that had ground to a halt, and a district that was openly hostile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez faced the inevitability of her political mortality. The end did not come with a bang, but with a carefully managed press release issued on a Friday afternoon, the traditional time slot for burying bad news. The statement was a masterwork of face-saving obfuscation, citing a desire to elevate the progressive conversation from a new vantage point and a need to focus on personal wellness and family obligations. It made no mention of the polls, the primary challenger, or the debate that had ended her career. However, the subtext was legible to every political observer in Washington. This was a capitulation. She was stepping down to avoid the historic indignity of being an incumbent, ousted in a landslide defeat. The press conference she held the following Monday was a surreal affair, attended by a press corps that sensed the blood in the water. She attempted to frame her departure as a victory, claiming she had shifted the Overton window and changed the conversation. Yet, when a reporter from a financial news network asked if she still stood by the $93 trillion figure for her climate plan, she ended the conference abruptly and walked off stage, a final retreat that mirrored her silence during the Kennedy debate. The silence that followed her exit was not one of mourning, but of relief. The political system, having expelled a foreign body that refused to conform to the laws of reality, returned to the business of boring, incremental, mathematical governance. The long-term legacy of the Great Debate extended far beyond the abbreviated career of one Congresswoman. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of American political discourse. It marked the end of the influencer era of politics, a brief and volatile period where social media metrics were mistaken for political capital. Candidates who had been modeling their strategies on the Ocasio-Cortez playbook, prioritizing Twitter dunks over committee work, abruptly pivoted. The Kennedy model became the new gold standard for aspiring legislators. Political consultants began advising clients to study the tape, referring to the 90 minutes in Atlanta. The lesson was clear. Style could win an election, but only substance could sustain a career. The voters, having seen the curtain pulled back to reveal the wizard was merely a content creator, developed a new immunity to viral charisma. They began to demand homework. In debates across the country, from school boards to the Senate, candidates began bringing calculators, binders of data, and specific citations to the podium. The question, how do you pay for that, transformed from an annoying technicality into the ultimate litmus test of legitimacy. Senator John Kennedy returned to the Senate not as a conqueror, but as a vindicated guardian of institutional seriousness. He rarely spoke of the debate publicly, maintaining the gentlemanly demeanor that had made his victory so devastating. However, his influence within the chamber grew exponentially. He became the gatekeeper of economic legislation. No bill could move forward without passing the Kennedy test, a rigorous review of its funding mechanisms and economic assumptions. He had proven that the American public was not, as many cynics believed, incapable of understanding complex math. They were simply waiting for someone to respect them enough to explain it clearly. The simple country lawyer had demonstrated that the most effective political weapon is not rage or charisma or ideology, but the quiet, unyielding application of truth. In the end, the history books would record the encounter not merely as a debate, but as a correction, a moment when the American political system, teetering on the edge of a fantasy-based economy, was pulled back to solid ground by the gravity of facts. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a cautionary tale, a footnote referencing the dangers of believing one's own hype. Her designer dresses were auctioned off, her luxury apartment lease expired, and her Twitter engagement dwindled to the background noise of a digital ghost town. But the lesson remained, etched into the collective memory of the electorate. You can fake a photo, you can fake a follower count, and you can fake a narrative, but you cannot fake the math. And when the bill comes due, as it always does, the person holding the calculator will always have the last word.